Lauren closed the door behind them, the city's wet asphalt gleaming under streetlights, and sank against it for a heartbeat, letting herself inhale the memory of mountain air and sunlit mornings. Sophie stirred in her arms, murmuring something about snowmen and cookies, tiny words tumbling like gold coins from her mouth. Lauren kissed her daughter's forehead, feeling a thrill she hadn't felt in years. Life, for once, was strange and full of grace. The card from Richard lay open on the counter, the script elegant, commanding, and intimate all at once, whispering of doors she hadn't known were waiting to be opened. And she knew, with an almost reckless certainty, that whatever lay ahead, whether in the penthouse, in boardrooms, or on snow-dusted paths in the Catskills, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Sophie's yellow gloves peeked out of her bag, a reminder that the smallest gestures could crack the hardest hearts, and Lauren allowed herself a quiet, almost daring, smile. The world had shifted, and she had survived it, dazzled and alive. Lauren never could have prepared herself for the ripple effect that the weekend and Sophie's audacious charm had unleashed in the penthouse. Mondays, Tuesdays, and every day in between were no longer a rigid regimen of cleaning and hushed footsteps. They were exercises in navigating the subtle currents of a man who had become inexplicably human. Richard Monroe, the tycoon whose reputation could silence a boardroom with a single glance, now paused to observe crayons on the counter, the way Sophie stacked her tiny plastic dishes, or how she carefully dusted a corner with exaggerated theatricality. It was unnerving and intoxicating all at once. Sophie thrived under this new rhythm, her confidence blooming like the first flowers in spring. Yellow gloves became a talisman, a secret code that meant she had somehow charmed the uncharmable. Lauren watched, heart swelling, as her daughter approached Richard with a question about the vase in the hallway or the peculiar way sunlight fell across the polished hardwood. And each time Richard answered, not as a boss, not as an untouchable figure, but with a patience and deliberateness that suggested the presence of someone remarkably changed. Ellen, never one to indulge sentimentality, whispered to herself, this won't last. Yet she secretly found herself tidying less rigidly, allowing Sophie the tiniest liberties, noting with amazement how Richard's sharp eyes softened when they caught her in moments of unself-conscious joy. Even the household seemed infused with a strange, luxurious light. The gleam of polished marble, the warm scent of bread, the hushed, reverent hum of distant city life through floor-to-ceiling windows. And then, one rainy Wednesday evening, Richard did something utterly unexpected. He emerged from his study, coat draped over his arm, sleeves slightly rumpled, and stopped near Sophie, who was busily arranging her crayon masterpieces. Lauren, he said, his voice carrying a rare warmth, I've arranged something for you both. He handed her a set of keys with a small leather tag. The lodge. Carmen will manage it this week. Consider it an extension of your weekend. Lauren's fingers trembled as she took them, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks. Sophie squealed, hugging her mother, yellow gloves pressed against her chest like a banner of victory. Richard's face, composed yet betraying the faintest shadow of a smile, watched them with quiet satisfaction. For a man who had built empires on control, on precision, on distance, this act was revolutionary. It was reckless. It was human. It was extraordinary. In that moment, Lauren realized that their lives had irrevocably changed. The city below, with its endless clamor and indifferent towers, felt distant and irrelevant. Here, in the luminous, ordered luxury of Richard Monroe's world, laughter had crept in, unexpected and dazzling. Sophie, gloves now a symbol of courage and mischief, had become a tiny ambassador of change, and Lauren understood that even the most guarded hearts could be touched, deliberately, tenderly, irreversibly, by the simplest acts of innocence and love. The future stretched before them like the snow-blanketed mountains, wild, untamed, and glittering with possibilities. And for once, Lauren allowed herself to hope, not cautiously, not in measured increments, but fully rebelliously, as if daring the universe to deny her this rare, luminous moment. The days that followed were unlike anything Lauren had imagined. The penthouse, with its panoramic skyline and polished perfection, had transformed from a place of tension and meticulous routine into a stage for small, unexpected magic. Richard Monroe, the iceberg in a tailored suit, had become a presence she both feared and adored in the same heartbeat. He still carried the weight of his empire in every gesture, every glance, yet now, within the walls of his home, he allowed fleeting glimpses of something else, something that made him human, almost achingly so. Sophie, undeterred by convention, took full advantage of the subtle shifts. She left her tiny fingerprints on glass vases, scattered crayons across the marble floors, and carried her yellow gloves like banners of mischief and innocence. Richard noticed everything, from the tilt of her head as she examined a painting to the serious way she tried to clean the silver candlesticks with her gloved fingertips. And each time, instead of the sharp reprimand Lauren had anticipated, he simply watched, sometimes crouching to meet her gaze, allowing the girl to feel seen. These small acts, a smile, a nod, a question asked and answered with deliberate patience, cracked open the fortress of his persona, revealing glimpses of warmth that had been buried for decades. Lauren, meanwhile, was caught in a swirl of disbelief and exhilaration. The card he had given her, the lodge, the cookies, each was a puzzle piece in an unexpected narrative, one in which she, a woman from Queens with no pedigree or entitlement, was somehow woven into the intricate, luxurious world of Richard Monroe. She found herself stealing glances at him, studying the way his jaw relaxed when Sophie laughed, the subtle softening of his eyes in the afternoon light. He was magnetic, terrifying, and infinitely complex, a force she had no hope of taming. And yet, in those rare shared moments, she felt a connection she could not explain, a tether to something beyond work or obligation. Then came the evening of the first real snowfall in Manhattan. Sophie, ecstatic, pressed her tiny hands against the glass, yellow gloves contrasting vividly against the white flakes swirling in the street below. "Mommy, Mommy, look, it's snowing. Like the mountains." Lauren laughed, feeling a pure, unguarded joy, and for a fleeting second, the city felt less like steel and more like possibility. Richard emerged from his study, drawn by the light and laughter, and for the first time, she saw him almost childlike in his curiosity, craning his neck to watch the flakes twirl. He didn't speak, simply allowed the moment to exist, breathing it in alongside them, merely a gift, but an invitation, an experiment of sorts. Each gesture from Richard, each careful allowance, each moment of quiet observation was a subtle breaking of boundaries, an encouragement to inhabit his world without fear. Sophie ran through the snow, cheeks red and nose pink, shrieking with delight, while Lauren watched, heart swelling, realizing that she had never truly experienced luxury like this. Not in marble, in views, in gold-flecked light, but in the sheer, unguarded human presence that he was beginning to offer them. And late one evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Richard appeared at the hearth, unannounced but not imposing, carrying 2 mugs of steaming cocoa. He handed one to Lauren, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "For you," he said simply, "for everything you've done, and for her." His eyes, normally so calculating, now held a depth she could almost read. They sipped in silence, the fire crackling, the mountains dark beyond the windows, and Lauren felt the unspoken tension of the past weeks dissolve. Here was Richard Monroe, not the iceberg, not the untouchable tycoon, but a man capable of gratitude, capable of tenderness, capable of allowing someone else's light to warm the cold spaces he had built around himself. In that silence, she understood something essential. Life's most luxurious moments were not measured in money, power, or influence, but in connection. In the unanticipated warmth of a cookie offered, a child's laughter, a shared glance that said everything without a word. And as she looked at him, watching the firelight dance across his features, Lauren knew that this was only the beginning. Only the first chapter of a story that promised danger, wonder, and an intimacy neither of them could have predicted, all woven together with the absurdly bright yellow gloves of a 4-year-old who had unknowingly rewritten the rules of a billionaire's world. The following week carried an energy in the penthouse that Lauren had never experienced in her life. Even Ellen, normally impervious to small wonders, moved with a curious lightness, as if the house itself had softened under Sophie's influence. Yellow gloves became a kind of unofficial uniform, marking the little girl's territory in the grandeur of polished marble and muted gold accents. Each time Sophie toddled past Richard's study, glancing up with wide-eyed curiosity, the air shifted. He would pause, watch her for a moment longer than necessary, and then, almost imperceptibly, follow her gaze to see what she saw. Lauren began to notice patterns in his behavior, tiny quirks that had been invisible before. He lingered over small things, a detail in a book, the placement of a vase, the way sunlight hit the edge of the coffee table. And every so often, she caught him smiling. Not the polite, calculated smile of a man who owned a city, but the kind that seemed to acknowledge a shared secret, something intimate and fragile. She wondered if anyone else in his world ever got to see that side of him. Sophie did, and that realization sent a strange thrill through her. A sense of privilege mixed with protective instinct. One late afternoon, after a particularly grueling day of cleaning and organizing, Lauren found herself standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, Sophie at her side, the city stretching infinitely below. Richard appeared behind them, hands tucked casually in his pockets, his usual commanding presence softened by the fading light. "You've done well today," he said, voice low and steady. Not a praise offered to an employee, but a recognition that felt personal, almost profound. Sophie looked up at him, smiling proudly. "I helped Uncle Rich," she said, fingers still gloved. Richard crouched to her level, his eyes locking onto hers. "And you did more than help. You reminded someone very important that joy exists in small, unexpected ways." Lauren felt her breath catch. Words like that had never been directed at her before. Not in school, not in jobs she had struggled to hold on to, not from anyone with the weight of the world on their shoulders. It made her pulse quicken in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Richard stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, and the moment was gone. But its echo lingered in the room like the scent of fresh-baked bread, warm and impossible to ignore. That evening, Lauren and Sophie returned to the lodge for an impromptu weekday stay, the city replaced by the serene vastness of snow-dusted woods and the low hum of wind through pines. Carmen had prepared the fireplace, and Lauren found herself laughing as Sophie tried to orchestrate a snowball fight with sticks and gloves, her imagination filling the blank white canvas of the yard. Richard appeared quietly, leaning against the doorway, silent at first. And then, without preamble, he joined in. Not forcefully, not as a host, but gently, tossing a small handful of snow toward Sophie, watching her squeal and dodge. Lauren's heart twisted in an unidentifiable mixture of awe, fear, and longing. The man who had once been untouchable, unreachable, was now laughing in the snow with her daughter. His coat dusted white, hair slightly mussed, eyes twinkling in the cold. He looked nothing like the iceberg of Manhattan legend. And yet, he was still the same man who could sign off on millions, command attention, and bend corporate titans to his will. It was intoxicating, impossible, dangerous. Later, as they warmed by the fire, Sophie asleep with her gloves clutched to her chest, Richard handed Lauren a cup of cocoa. "You've given her memories," he said quietly, almost confidingly. "And in doing so, reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten." Lauren felt the weight of the words, unspoken in most of their interactions, seep into her chest. It wasn't a declaration. Not yet. But it was a bridge, delicate and fragile, connecting them across a chasm she had never thought she could cross. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the lodge walls, and Lauren realized the truth. She was no longer just a cleaner, no longer just a caretaker for Sophie. She had become part of a hidden world, a luxurious, terrifying, breathtaking world where a billionaire could be moved by a child's laughter, where a simple act like sharing a cookie could unravel years of carefully constructed armor. And somewhere deep inside, Lauren understood that nothing about her life, or his, would ever be the same. The future was no longer a predictable grid of survival and routine. It was wide, wild, and glittering with the kind of possibility that made her pulse quicken and her stomach flutter. And Richard Monroe, the man who ruled empires, had begun to follow a map only Sophie could draw. One of vulnerability, joy, and the uncharted thrill of letting someone in. The days turned into a rhythm, strange and unspoken, in which Sophie's laughter became the heartbeat of the penthouse, and Richard's presence was less a shadow of authority than a quiet, constant pulse of possibility. Lauren noticed it most in the small gestures. The way he paused at corners to watch Sophie arrange her toys. The subtle tilt of his head when she narrated the day's adventures in her uneven, animated sentences. The man who had once frozen grown executives with a glance now stooped, crouched, and leaned, deliberately reducing the distance between his colossal world and their small, unassuming lives. One Thursday afternoon, Lauren caught herself staring at him across the marble expanse of the living room. He was standing by the windows, coat removed, sleeves rolled slightly, and Sophie was tugging at his tie. Not to pull it exactly, but in an earnest attempt at engagement, a child's unfiltered invitation. And Richard, to everyone's astonishment, bent his head down to meet her, his eyes soft, the corners crinkled in a rare expression of delight. "Are you building the world's tallest tower?" he asked, voice calm, almost playful. Sophie nodded vigorously. "It's for you, Uncle Rich, to keep your empire from falling." Lauren's breath caught. The words, innocent and offhand, carried weight she could not have anticipated. Richard chuckled, a sound so uncommon in the penthouse that it made her feel lightheaded. And in that laughter, there was an acknowledgement of something he had kept hidden for years. The quiet, unpolished human yearning for connection that could not be governed by contracts, by power, or by glass and steel. That evening, he invited Lauren and Sophie to dinner. Not at some lavish restaurant, not in the formal dining room of the penthouse, but in the private library, candles flickering against the leather-bound volumes, creating a cocoon of warmth. Lauren served Sophie's favorite pasta, while Richard poured wine for himself and left water for her. The subtle care a study in contrast to his usual, calculated demeanor. Conversation was sparse, deliberate, but the silence was no longer sterile. It was companionable, comfortable. For the first time, Lauren felt that she wasn't merely tolerated. She was welcomed. The following weekend, Richard orchestrated another quiet revelation. He arranged for a surprise visit to the rooftop terrace, which had been closed to everyone except staff. The city stretched below like a constellation of lights, and as Sophie bounced in place, yellow gloves flashing, Richard lifted her gently, letting her feel the wind on her cheeks. "See, Sophie," he said softly. "The city looks different from up here." She laughed, the sound pure, ringing against the night air, and Lauren felt an ache of gratitude and disbelief. The man who had once been an untouchable enigma was now offering glimpses of his world with care, delicacy, and the faintest tremor of vulnerability. Over time, Lauren began to recognize the patterns of his humanity. The way he lingered at the edge of observation, letting Sophie's world unfold before him. The meticulous thought behind even small gestures. The subtle changes in his voice, the warmth that crept into corners she had once thought unreachable. Each moment revealed the tension between the man he had built himself to be and the man who had learned, through a child's laughter and a pair of absurdly large yellow gloves, that life's most precious luxuries were not financial, they were human. And in those quiet, stolen moments, Lauren realized that she had stepped into a story that defied expectation. A narrative in which power met tenderness, in which walls could be dismantled by the smallest hands, and in which the impossible became tangible through patience, laughter, and the courage to allow oneself to feel. Sophie slept that night with her gloves by her pillow, and Lauren sat by the window, gazing at the skyline, understanding finally that the rhythm of this household, of Richard, of Sophie, of herself, was no longer about survival or duty. It was about witnessing, participating in, and safeguarding a fragile, glittering humanity that might never exist anywhere else. And Richard Monroe, for all his calculated brilliance and icy reputation, had begun to live in the same rare, intoxicating way, fully, vulnerably, and irrevocably changed by the laughter of a 4-year-old girl with yellow gloves and an irrepressible sense of wonder. The iceberg had melted, imperceptibly, beautifully, and Lauren knew that the story unfolding in the penthouse was only just beginning. The transformation of the penthouse continued in subtle yet unmistakable ways. The air was lighter, more alive. The rigid cadence of footsteps and clipped instructions was replaced by the soft rhythm of laughter and the quiet hum of human connection. Sophie, now an unspoken anchor of the household, moved confidently through rooms that had once seemed imposing and unyielding, leaving traces of her joy. Tiny smudges on glass, crayons strewn across polished floors, the unmistakable footprint of her yellow gloves, without eliciting a word of scolding from Richard. Instead, he observed these marks with the faintest of smiles, as if each one were a token of life seeping into the sterile elegance he had once meticulously curated. Lauren, though still navigating the delicate balance of employee and caretaker, felt her own presence shift within the penthouse. She was no longer merely a service provider. She had become part of a fragile ecosystem of trust, affection, and understated luxury. Richard's attention, though never overt, was now a constant undertone in her consciousness. The way he would glance toward Sophie, the subtle recognition in his eyes when she completed a chore or made a creative flourish, left Lauren both unsettled and exhilarated. His gestures, once purely functional, had begun to carry intention and warmth. One Saturday morning, Lauren arrived with Sophie to find the penthouse transformed for their benefit. A small basket of fresh pastries awaited them, each delicately crafted and arranged with precision. Richard stood nearby, hands tucked behind his back, watching with that impossible calm that somehow carried an intimacy all its own. "I thought you might enjoy breakfast here before the city wakes fully," he said quietly, his voice devoid of the usual imperious edge. Sophie squealed in delight, immediately dragging a chair to the table, gloves still perched on her small hands. As they ate, conversation flowed in measured but natural bursts. Sophie chattered about school, the yellow gloves, and her latest artistic endeavors, while Lauren shared snippets of her life, cautiously testing the boundaries of openness. Richard listened, truly listened, responding in ways that revealed both thoughtfulness and a rare vulnerability. He recounted stories of his own childhood, rare glimpses into the man he had been before the empire, before the ice, before the carefully constructed walls. His words were precise, yet there was a softness that Lauren had never encountered. By the end of breakfast, Lauren realized something profound. The penthouse was no longer just a symbol of wealth or status. It had become a sanctuary, a place where connection, however fragile, could flourish. Even the grandeur, once intimidating, now seemed to cradle them, framing their interactions with elegance rather than intimidation. Sophie clapped her hands in delight, declaring that the yellow gloves had officially become magical, capable of turning the strictest, most intimidating adults into friends. Later that afternoon, Richard proposed an uncharacteristic activity, a private tour of his art collection. The normally austere corridors of the penthouse had been arranged with care, each painting, sculpture, and artifact selected for its visual impact and historical significance. Yet, as they moved through the collection, Sophie's wide-eyed fascination prompted explanations and stories from Richard himself, an unusual departure from his usual reserved commentary. He knelt occasionally to point out details, to illustrate a brushstroke, or to recount the story behind a particular sculpture. His engagement was deliberate, attentive, almost tender. Lauren followed silently, struck by the paradox of the man before her. Commanding yet gentle, imposing yet deeply human. And as Sophie darted between pieces, gloves clumsily tracing edges, giggling at her own shadow, Lauren understood that this weekend, these shared moments, were recalibrating more than just Sophie's understanding of the world. They were reshaping the very essence of Richard Monroe. The fortress around his heart, painstakingly constructed over decades, was slowly giving way to light, laughter, and the warmth of human connection. By the time evening descended, the penthouse was bathed in the amber glow of chandeliers and city lights. Sophie was curled on the sofa, gloves off but clutched to her chest like a talisman, exhausted but elated. Lauren sat beside her, savoring the quiet triumph of a day unmarked by tension or fear. Richard remained in the study, though Lauren knew he was close enough to hear every word of Sophie's soft recitations about the day. And in that silence, Lauren felt the extraordinary, almost surreal certainty that their lives had shifted irrevocably, forever intertwined by laughter, trust, and the audacious heart of a small girl in yellow gloves. The luxury of the penthouse had revealed its truest nature. Not wealth or power, but the capacity for transformation, for softening, for vulnerability. And at the heart of it all, Lauren realized, was the quiet, extraordinary magic of a child's innocence, and the improbable man who had learned to let himself be touched by it. The story that had begun with a vanilla wafer and a pair of oversized gloves was far from over. It had only just begun to unfold, in slow, deliberate, breathtakingly human chapters. The following week brought a rhythm to the penthouse that was at once intoxicating and disorienting. Richard Monroe, once a man defined by absolute control, began to operate on an entirely different wavelength. He remained meticulous, exacting, and sharp, still the iceberg in the boardroom. But the spaces Sophie and Lauren occupied were now charged with a warmth that had never existed before. Yellow gloves became almost a talisman, a symbol of innocence and imperfection that he tolerated, even cherished. Richard observed with quiet fascination as Sophie experimented with flour on the marble countertops, giggling as Lauren scolded her in mock frustration. One rainy Wednesday, Lauren returned from a quick errand to find the penthouse dimly lit, the city blurred behind the windows by streaks of water. Sophie was building an elaborate fort from cushions and blankets in the living room, yellow gloves abandoned momentarily on the floor, her imagination creating kingdoms out of discarded paper and throw pillows. Richard stood at the edge of the fort, leaning casually against a column, a cup of coffee in hand. "Are you planning to conquer Manhattan with that?" he asked, his voice low, amused. Sophie looked up, eyes blazing with seriousness. "Not Manhattan. My kingdom. And you're invited, Uncle Rich." Lauren froze, staring. Richard, the man who could command entire corporations with a single gesture, crouched down and allowed Sophie to drape a tiny blanket over his shoulders. The sight struck her like a physical blow. The power, the wealth, the carefully curated distance, all set aside for a child's game. And yet, there was no condescension, no performative indulgence. His engagement was complete, attentive, and almost tender. It was a sight that left Lauren breathless, a revelation of the humanity she had only glimpsed in fragments until now. As days melted into nights, the dynamic continued to shift. Richard began inviting them into corners of his life previously closed to everyone. His private art collection, the penthouse rooftop garden, rare bottles from a wine cellar. Each experience was carefully curated but also infused with a startling intimacy. Sophie ran gleefully from one space to another, gloves flopping, laughter echoing in rooms that had once held only the quiet hum of controlled operations. And Richard, the man who seemed frozen in a perpetual state of vigilance, now paused to watch, to interact, to listen. Lauren found herself noticing the subtleties. The way he allowed Sophie to place her small hand on the polished grand piano, letting her plink at keys she could barely reach. The way he answered her endless questions with patience, without the trace of irritation. The slight relaxation in his posture whenever she laughed. These moments were dangerous in the most exquisite way. They invited connection, a vulnerability that could upend both of their worlds if mishandled. Yet, for Lauren, there was a magnetic pull she could not resist, a fascination with the man behind the legend, the iceberg with melting edges. One evening, after a day of impromptu snowball fights, courtesy of Carmen's snow machine, and a mountain hike through frost-laden paths, Lauren found herself in the kitchen preparing dinner while Sophie played quietly by the window. Richard appeared beside her without a word, holding a small tray with a single vanilla wafer on it, the icing still bright and cheerful. "For the woman who keeps the kingdom in order," he said simply. Lauren laughed, disbelief and warmth intermingling in her chest. She took it, savoring the sweetness not just of the cookie, but of the gesture, the recognition, the unspoken acknowledgement of the life she had carved out for Sophie and herself. Later, after Sophie fell asleep, Richard lingered by the fire, the golden light flickering across his face. "Do you ever wonder," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "how different life might be if we allowed ourselves these small luxuries?" Lauren felt the weight of the question, the subtle undercurrent of introspection. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice soft, "but I've learned to cherish them when they come." His gaze softened in a way that few had ever seen. "You've taught me that," he said, and in that statement lay a gravity that made the air between them vibrate with possibility. Something neither duty, fear, nor decorum could contain. The weekend concluded with a long, slow drive back to the city. Sophie slept in the back seat, yellow gloves tucked into her coat pocket like talismans, and Lauren kept her hand near hers, heart still thrumming from the intensity of the weekend. Richard, unusually quiet at the wheel, glanced at her once, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding. The empire awaited him, with its endless meetings and impossible decisions. Yet in these fleeting hours, the veneer of ice had softened completely. The story that began with a vanilla wafer and a pair of oversized gloves had evolved into something larger, infinitely more complex. A delicate, precarious interweaving of power, vulnerability, and the intoxicating, uncharted luxury of human connection. And Lauren knew, as the city lights blurred past in streaks of gold and white, that nothing would ever be the same. Sophie had opened doors that money could never buy. Laughter had cracked the armor of the untouchable. And a weekend in a mountain lodge had changed the trajectory of all their lives. The penthouse, the empire, the icebound legend of Richard Monroe. All of it had become something softer, more human, and impossibly, achingly alive. The following days in the penthouse were a delicate dance of routine and unexpected warmth. Sophie's presence, gloves perpetually in place, had become the linchpin of the household, a catalyst for moments of genuine connection that no one, least of all Lauren, could have anticipated. Richard moved through the apartment differently now, not just as a meticulous overseer of his empire, but as a man attuned to the subtle rhythms of life around him. He would appear at the breakfast table with a quiet observation, a playful comment, or an unexpected question that drew laughter from Sophie and startled admiration from Lauren. One evening, Lauren was straightening books in the study when Richard appeared, standing in the doorway like a shadow softened by lamplight. He held a small, intricately wrapped box. "For Sophie," he said simply. She would be asleep soon, but he wanted her to find it in the morning. Lauren accepted it with trembling hands, noting the rare vulnerability in his eyes. The box contained a delicate, hand-carved snow globe of the Catskills lodge, complete with minuscule yellow gloves perched inside like Sophie herself. The gesture was so intimate, so personal, that Lauren felt her chest tighten. He was no longer simply offering wealth or convenience. He was offering thoughtfulness, care, and a connection forged in trust. The next day, Sophie discovered the snow globe and squealed in delight, glancing up at Lauren with an expression that mixed triumph and disbelief. "Uncle Rich made this for me," she declared. Lauren smiled, caught between awe and incredulity. She watched as Richard observed quietly from the study doorway, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his mouth. That small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips carried more power than any executive decree. It was acknowledgement, admiration, and perhaps even affection, folded into a single gesture. Over the weeks, a pattern of subtle intimacy unfolded. Richard invited Sophie into his rarefied world in small, carefully measured ways, showing her the mechanics of his antique watches, teaching her the names of trees visible from the terrace, letting her help with his private ledger by drawing small doodles in the margins. Lauren observed all of it, heart beating fast with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. The man she had once feared, whose presence had seemed untouchable and forbidding, was being rewritten before her eyes, through laughter, curiosity, and the raw honesty of a child who saw no need for pretense. One cold Friday evening, after an afternoon spent arranging flowers from the penthouse garden, Richard surprised them with tickets to a private concert. The city's lights stretched like molten gold beneath them as they arrived, Lauren and Sophie in tow, yellow gloves safely tucked into Sophie's coat pocket. Richard, ever precise, had arranged for them to have seats in a small balcony, isolated from the crowd, giving them privacy while still sharing in the grandeur. Sophie clutched Lauren's hand, eyes wide with excitement. "This is amazing," she whispered, and Lauren felt a swell of gratitude for the life she never thought possible. During the performance, Lauren caught Richard watching Sophie more than he was watching the musicians. He leaned slightly toward her at one point, a low murmur of commentary about the notes and harmony. A voice that, for all its soft richness, conveyed something more intimate, a recognition of beauty and joy in shared experience. Lauren's gaze lingered on him, heart fluttering at the sight of the iceberg revealing cracks of warmth, light, and laughter. Later, back in the penthouse, the evening had grown late. Sophie, exhausted from the day, had fallen asleep on the sofa, her yellow gloves draped haphazardly over a pillow like a small badge of conquest. Lauren sat beside her, tracing a finger lightly over the soft fabric, feeling the extraordinary weight of everything that had happened in such a short time. Richard entered quietly, carrying 2 steaming mugs of cocoa, and placed one beside her. "You're doing more than you realize," he said softly, the words carrying a gravity and sincerity that Lauren couldn't ignore. "You've given Sophie, and me, a world we didn't know we needed." Lauren lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a moment the world held its breath. No words could capture the intensity of that instant. Power, wealth, vulnerability, and trust all converged in a single, quiet exchange. She realized with startling clarity that the story that began with a vanilla wafer and oversized yellow gloves had blossomed into something far greater. It was no longer just Sophie's influence. It was the beginning of a profound, unspoken transformation in all 3 of their lives. A delicate, beautiful upheaval of expectation, fear, and possibility. And as the fire crackled, casting shadows across the walls, Lauren knew the truth with an almost terrifying certainty. Nothing in her life or Richard Monroe's would ever be the same again. The iceberg had shifted, melted at the edges, revealing the warmth beneath, and the world they had created together in laughter, trust, and quiet revelation was only beginning to reveal its endless, intoxicating possibilities. The next morning arrived with a soft, golden light spilling across the penthouse. Sophie was already awake, yellow gloves perched on her tiny hands as she methodically arranged stuffed animals in neat rows across the living room floor. Lauren sipped her coffee in silence, marveling at the extraordinary ease with which life had begun to settle into this strange, luxurious orbit. Richard entered quietly from the study, his coat casually draped over one arm, eyes scanning the room with the faintest hint of a smile. "Morning," he said, voice low, almost intimate. Sophie waved vigorously. "Uncle Rich, look, I made an army of bears." Her enthusiasm was unstoppable, infectious. Richard crouched, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of animals, and said, "Impressive strategy. Are they ready for a day of adventure?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "They must be fed first." She placed one of her yellow-gloved hands over a tiny stuffed bear, patting it with ceremonial care. Lauren bit back a laugh at the absurdity and warmth of it all. By mid-morning, they were unexpectedly whisked away in the Range Rover again, this time to a quiet part of Central Park that Richard had a private pass for. A surprise awaited Sophie. A small artificial hill, arranged with Carmen's help, complete with a carefully timed snow machine. The child's squeals of delight echoed through the trees as she launched herself down the hill, gloves flapping wildly, while Lauren watched, breathless, at the full sweep of her daughter's joy. Richard stood nearby, hands tucked in his coat pockets, observing with a careful, near-reverent attention. Each laugh, each stumble, each shout of triumph was etched into the lines of his face, softening the sharp angles of a life built for efficiency, control, and distance. Afterward, as Sophie collapsed on a blanket with rosy cheeks and sparkling eyes, Richard offered a rare, personal gesture. A thermos of hot chocolate, the lid pressed firmly into Sophie's tiny hands. "Here," he said, "for your royal army." Sophie took it seriously, sipping carefully, as if the beverage were a treasure of immeasurable worth. Lauren felt her heart tighten. These moments of kindness were not occasional, not fleeting. They were deliberate, carefully considered, and utterly transformative. That evening back at the penthouse, after Sophie had fallen asleep curled around her teddy, Richard invited Lauren to the terrace, a glass of wine in hand. The city sprawled below them, glittering and vast. Yet up here it felt intimate, almost private. "You know," he said, voice quiet, "I've spent decades building walls I thought would protect me. But sometimes, the smallest things, cookies, gloves, laughter, find a way through." Lauren looked at him, struck by the rare vulnerability in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in his voice. "Sophie found your walls," she said softly, words caught between awe and disbelief. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "And you've helped her." Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm deepened. Lauren noticed subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the penthouse itself. A chair pulled closer to the window for Sophie's afternoon reading sessions. A small basket of her favorite treats left on the marble counter. The art strategically arranged to spark curiosity rather than intimidate. Richard, meanwhile, began to linger in spaces he had never entered before. Standing just outside the kitchen while Sophie experimented with baking, or pausing by the piano to watch her plunk at keys, hands flapping, gloves occasionally bouncing from her wrists. Lauren herself felt a shift within, subtle but undeniable. The tension that had always hovered at the edge of her consciousness, the perpetual fear of misstep, the careful calculation of words and gestures, began to fade. She moved with an unexpected freedom, laughed with ease, and allowed herself small indulgences of pleasure, like lingering over a cup of tea while Sophie played nearby. The impossible, once defined by Richard Monroe's imperviousness, was becoming possible. A life in which warmth, laughter, and human connection were not just tolerated, but celebrated. One night, after a long day filled with snow machines, walks through the penthouse garden, and storytelling by the fireplace, Lauren found herself alone with Richard. Sophie slept in her room, gloves tucked under her pillow, breathing softly in dreams filled with laughter. Richard poured a glass of wine and handed it to her. "To small miracles," he said quietly. Lauren clinked her glass gently against his. "And to yellow gloves," she whispered, smiling. He allowed himself a rare, unguarded laugh, the sound echoing through the apartment, full of unspoken promise, warmth, and the quiet magic of an ordinary world made extraordinary by human connection. And in that luminous, fragile moment, Lauren understood something essential. This story, one that began with a vanilla wafer and a pair of oversized gloves, was no longer just about Sophie's influence or Richard's thawing heart. It was about the radical, intoxicating possibility of transformation. The notion that even the coldest, most unyielding lives could be reshaped, softened, and made luminous by trust, care, and the extraordinary courage to allow oneself to feel. And as the city lights twinkled like distant stars below, she felt certain that their lives would never return to the way they had been, and she would not want them to. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt impossibly luxurious, a rhythm that balanced routine with delight, discipline with whimsy. Sophie's presence in the penthouse became a constant catalyst for unexpected joy. The yellow gloves, now a fixture of her persona, symbolized not just innocence, but a rare, unspoken key to unlocking the walls Richard Monroe had built around himself. Lauren observed quietly as Richard moved through the space, no longer just as a distant, commanding figure, but as a man attuned to small pleasures and subtleties. He lingered where he had never lingered before, smiled with a near imperceptible warmth, and occasionally allowed his gaze to soften in ways that left Lauren breathless. One morning, Lauren arrived to find the penthouse transformed once again. Sophie had organized a tea party for her stuffed animals on the living room rug, yellow gloves in place, tiny chairs precariously arranged. Richard stood nearby, a rare image of patience and focus, guiding her in the art of setting proper etiquette for the plush attendees. "Careful," he instructed. "The muffins must be shared evenly." Sophie nodded solemnly, her attention rapt, as if the stakes were those of the highest boardroom meeting. Lauren leaned against the doorway, marveling at the scene. Her daughter, her gloves, the man of ice who now moved with such warmth and precision, fully immersed in play. The afternoon brought another subtle miracle. Richard led them to the rooftop garden, where Carmen had set up a small observatory telescope. The sky, a sweeping canvas of city haze slowly giving way to clear evening, held a constellation map that Richard pointed out with deliberate care. Sophie's small hand clutched his, yellow gloves forgotten, as she gasped at the first glimpse of Saturn's rings. "Uncle Rich, it's magic," she whispered. Lauren felt a wave of awe and gratitude. It was impossible to articulate how profoundly these small acts, the cookie, the gloves, the trips to the lodge, the telescope, had rewritten the texture of their lives. As weeks passed, Lauren noticed more than just Sophie's influence on Richard. The penthouse itself seemed to breathe differently. Art was arranged not only for aesthetic admiration but to spark curiosity. Furniture was subtly shifted to encourage conversation or quiet contemplation. Richard lingered where he had never lingered before. At the kitchen counter while Sophie stirred her cocoa, in the hall while she played with blocks, even by the front door to wave them off in the morning. Each presence was deliberate, thoughtful, revealing an intimacy that Lauren had only glimpsed in the rarest of moments. One particularly quiet evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep clutching her gloves to her chest like a talisman, Richard invited Lauren to the terrace. The city sprawled beneath them, glittering and infinite, and the soft glow of distant lights created a cocoon around them. He poured 2 glasses of wine and handed her one, the gesture carrying a gravity and care that made her pulse quicken. "To Sophie," he said simply, "and to the small miracles she brings into our lives." Lauren clinked her glass gently, words caught in her throat. "And to Yellow Gloves," she added, a soft laugh escaping her. He allowed himself a full, unguarded smile, the sound echoing across the terrace, warm and unexpectedly intimate. The following weekend, Richard suggested a private outing beyond the city. A secluded Riverside estate, untouched and pristine, became the setting for another chapter in this quietly evolving story. Sophie explored freely, gloves flapping, laughter carrying across the water. Lauren watched Richard interact in ways that were impossible to witness in Manhattan's polished corridors. Teaching Sophie to skip stones, constructing a small raft from driftwood, letting her race ahead with a freedom he had never allowed in the penthouse. Each action revealed layers of his character previously buried beneath authority and discipline, a vulnerability and warmth that Lauren had begun to recognize as profoundly rare. Back at the penthouse later that evening, after Sophie had been tucked into bed, Richard lingered in the living room with Lauren, quiet and reflective. "I never imagined," he admitted voice low, "that someone could teach me to see the world this way again." Lauren felt the weight of his confession, knowing that the man she had once feared had opened himself in ways no employee, or even a friend, had ever been allowed to witness. "She's remarkable," she said softly, "and so are you, when you let yourself be." His gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, but it carried a warmth that left Lauren's heart pounding. And so, the story that had begun with a simple vanilla wafer and oversized yellow gloves continued to unfold, each day deepening the extraordinary intimacy and transformation that none of them had anticipated. The penthouse, the city, the empire, everything had shifted. Sophie had opened doors no amount of money or power could have breached, and in doing so had rewritten the very essence of Richard Monroe. Lauren realized that they were all bound now by laughter, trust, and the quiet, unassailable magic of human connection. A story that had only just begun, with chapters far too rich, too intricate, and too alive to ever conclude. The weeks that followed were marked by a subtle revolution in the penthouse, one that unfolded not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, transformative shifts of daily life. Sophie's presence, with her yellow gloves and boundless imagination, had become the heartbeat of the apartment. Richard, once the untouchable iceberg of Manhattan's financial elite, now moved with a grace and attentiveness that had never been part of his repertoire. He lingered in corners of the apartment that had once been forbidden to visitors, allowing himself to observe and interact, to guide and be guided in return, all in the service of a 4-year-old's joy. One chilly Saturday morning, Lauren found herself in the kitchen, arranging pastries for Sophie while Richard stood nearby, a soft scarf loosely draped around his neck. He was unusually quiet, watching Sophie as she crafted an elaborate castle from cereal boxes and leftover packing paper, gloves flopping from her small hands. "She has remarkable focus," he said, almost to himself. Lauren paused, noticing the faint reverence in his tone. "She does," she replied softly, unsure whether he wanted conversation or simply the acknowledgement. There was a subtle vulnerability in him that made the space between them feel charged, fragile, alive. By late morning, Richard suggested a spontaneous trip to the Central Park Zoo. Sophie shrieked with delight at the idea, gloves bouncing as she hopped from foot to foot. Lauren followed behind, half expecting the rigid, cold Monroe to revert to his usual self. But he didn't. He guided Sophie gently, explaining the animals with a patience that Lauren had never witnessed before, kneeling to her level when she asked questions, sharing in her wide-eyed wonder. Even strangers in the park noticed the unusual tableau. A little girl in oversized yellow gloves, a woman with a careful but radiant smile, and a man whose presence usually commanded fear, now entirely present and disarmed by the child's joy. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Lauren sat with Richard on the penthouse terrace. The city stretched endlessly below, lights shimmering like a reflection of stars in water. He poured 2 glasses of wine, handing her one. "Do you ever wonder how much life we miss when we're so focused on control?" he asked quietly. Lauren met his gaze, sensing the gravity behind the question. "Every day," she admitted. "But I think we're allowed to notice the small things now, thanks to her." He smiled, the faintest curve of lips that seemed almost impossible on a man so accustomed to precision. "Yes, thanks to her and perhaps to these," he added, gesturing vaguely, as if encompassing Sophie, her gloves, and the fragile new world they had built together. In the following days, Richard began inviting them into more of his personal world. There were visits to his private art studio, where Lauren helped Sophie paint on a miniature canvas while he observed, sipping coffee, occasionally making suggestions that were thoughtful, almost tender. He introduced them to a secluded garden on the rooftop, where Sophie ran through winding paths, yellow gloves flapping, while he watched with an unusual softness. Lauren noticed how the empire he commanded never intruded on these spaces. Here, power was suspended, replaced by curiosity, play, and the rare luxury of simple human connection. One Sunday evening, after an afternoon spent exploring a hidden bookstore tucked between 2 Manhattan streets, Sophie slept in Lauren's arms on the couch, gloves tucked into her coat pocket. Richard sat nearby, quietly arranging a selection of rare books he had purchased for Sophie, small stories and picture books, each carefully chosen. "I suppose it's odd," he said, voice low, "to find that someone so small can have such a profound impact on a life built on control." Lauren tilted her head, looking at him through the soft lamplight. "It's not odd. It's inevitable. Children have a way of finding the cracks we try so hard to hide behind." He allowed himself a small, rare laugh, one that sounded like release rather than amusement, and for the first time in years, Lauren felt entirely unguarded around him. As winter approached, Carmen suggested a trip to the Catskills again, this time to see the first snowfalls of the season. Sophie bounced with excitement, gloves already packed in her bag, while Lauren felt the familiar mixture of awe and trepidation. Richard had arranged everything, as he always did, but this time, he lingered with them on the penthouse terrace before departure, the cityscape behind them shimmering in the cold evening light. "Enjoy it," he said simply, the words carrying a weight Lauren could feel in her chest. "Take in every moment. It's ours to remember." And with that, they departed, the Range Rover gliding through the streets, the golden glow of the city fading behind them, leaving open the promise of snow, laughter, and a world remade by the smallest, most extraordinary of gestures. A vanilla wafer, a pair of yellow gloves, and the extraordinary heart of a child. The Catskills greeted them with a brittle chill in the air and the first hints of snow dusting the pine needles like powdered sugar. Sophie pressed her face to the car window, gloves snug, eyes wide with anticipation, her small hands tapping eagerly against the glass. Lauren, sitting beside her, felt a flutter of excitement and disbelief. 3 weeks ago, she had been a single mother struggling to make ends meet, and now she was heading into a winter wonderland courtesy of one of Manhattan's most elusive billionaires. The surreal nature of it all made her heart pound in ways she hadn't felt in years. Upon arrival, the lodge rose before them like a sanctuary carved from timber and stone, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, the warm amber glow of its windows spilling into the dusk. Sophie practically leapt from the car, gloves bouncing as she ran across the snow-dusted driveway, Lauren and Paul hurrying to keep pace. Richard followed quietly, his presence calm but deliberate, observing the scene with a mixture of pride and something Lauren couldn't quite name. Something softer, vulnerable, almost human in its intensity. It was as if he were allowing himself to feel for the first time in decades, in the presence of a child who trusted him without question. Inside, Carmen had outdone herself. The lodge smelled of pine and firewood, hot chocolate steaming on the counter, and a small tray of vanilla wafers arranged like miniature soldiers on a plate, glistening with icing. Sophie's eyes shone as she slipped into the warm interior, shedding her gloves to touch the hearth, then immediately slipping them back on out of habit and comfort. Richard watched her, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. His usual crisp posture softened. Lauren noticed the subtle shift in him, the careful pauses in his speech, the gentle intonation when he spoke to Sophie, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. The man who had once been an iceberg in the city had become something entirely new, something fluid, alive, capable of warmth. That evening, after a long walk through the surrounding forest, Sophie collapsed onto a fur rug in front of the fire, her gloves perched beside her like silent companions. Lauren sat on the sofa across from Richard, who had poured himself a glass of whiskey. "You see her," he said softly, eyes not leaving the fire. "Not as a child, not as a problem, not as someone who complicates my life. You see her as light." Lauren felt a lump in her throat. "She's extraordinary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But so are you when you let yourself be. You're more than just control." He gave a small, almost shy laugh, something between amusement and humility, and for the first time, Lauren sensed a genuine humanity behind the calculated precision she had once feared. Over the next 2 days, the snow arrived in earnest, thick and soft, coating the lodge and trees in a glittering white blanket. Sophie ran outside in her yellow gloves, building snowmen, crafting snow angels, and letting out shrieks of delight that echoed across the hills. Richard, for the first time fully unguarded, joined in, crouching beside her to build a snowman, carefully shaping the snow with gloved hands, teaching her the delicate art of balance and proportion. Lauren watched, amazed at the transformation, the absolute reversal of the man who had once been so inaccessible. Here, with a child and a mother who trusted him implicitly, he was present, warm, and entirely alive. Late one evening, as the wind howled outside and the lodge settled into silence, Lauren found herself alone with Richard in the grand sitting room. The fire flickered across the carved wooden panels, painting his sharp features with golden warmth. "You've changed things," she said softly. "Not just for Sophie, but for yourself." He leaned back in the armchair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "She's changed everything," he admitted, voice low, almost reverent. I never allowed myself to think I could feel this way again. And yet, here I am." Lauren felt the weight of those words, a gravity that was rare and intoxicating, and realized that the weekend, the snow, the gloves, the cookies, had become something far greater than she had imagined. By the time Sunday rolled around, Sophie had reluctantly packed her gloves away, convinced they had completed their magical work. The drive back to the city was quiet, filled with exhausted satisfaction, the snow-streaked trees blurring past the window. Lauren glanced at Richard in the passenger seat, noticing the subtle traces of emotion on his face, the softness in his posture that hadn't been there before. He caught her glance and offered the faintest smile, a silent acknowledgement that this weekend had shifted the axis of all their lives. Sophie slept soundly in the back seat, gloves clutched to her chest like a talisman, unaware of the quiet, profound change she had wrought. As they returned to the penthouse, Lauren realized with a startling clarity that life had irrevocably altered. The vanilla wafer, the yellow gloves, the child's unguarded laughter. They were the catalysts for something entirely unexpected. The thawing of an iceberg, the illumination of warmth in a world built on cold calculation. And in the quiet moments, watching Sophie's deep, peaceful sleep, and Richard's rare moments of reflection and vulnerability, Lauren understood that their story was only beginning. An intricate, luxurious tapestry woven with laughter, trust, and the extraordinary power of human connection. The return to Manhattan felt different, almost surreal. After the pristine, snow-dusted world of the Catskills, the city's relentless hum, once oppressive, now seemed almost intimate in contrast to the wide-open spaces they had left behind. Sophie yawned against Lauren's shoulder, gloves tucked safely in her backpack, cheeks still rosy from the mountain cold. Lauren felt a quiet satisfaction in her chest, a sense that they had stepped through a door into a new chapter of their lives, one full of unexpected generosity, laughter, and possibility. That evening, as Sophie slept, Lauren lingered in the penthouse kitchen, organizing the small remnants of their weekend. Crumbs of cookies, stray bits of paper from Sophie's crafts. Richard appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of tea, a rare casualness in his posture. "I saw the photos you two took," he said, voice soft, almost intimate. "You captured her spirit perfectly." Lauren blinked, surprised at the warmth in his tone. "Thank you," she murmured. She has a way of making ordinary things magical." Richard's eyes softened as he looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights reflecting in them like distant stars. "And she reminds me of things I forgot to care about," he admitted. It was not a confession. It was a revelation, quiet and profound, and Lauren felt the weight of it, sensing just how rare it was for him to allow such vulnerability. Days became weeks, and the rhythm of their lives shifted subtly yet irrevocably. Sophie's laughter became a fixture in the penthouse, her yellow gloves popping up like markers of joy in unexpected corners. Richard, ever the meticulous observer, began leaving small surprises for her. A stack of illustrated books on the coffee table, a carefully chosen puzzle, or a simple plate of vanilla wafers decorated with icing faces. He watched her reaction with the quiet intensity of a man discovering a new dimension of life, one that required no spreadsheets, contracts, or control. Lauren noticed how he lingered at the edges of play, guiding gently, correcting softly, his presence transforming from authority to companionship without losing the gravity that defined him. One chilly afternoon, Richard suggested a visit to a hidden art gallery tucked into a quiet street in Soho. Sophie, gloves in hand, skipped ahead, excitedly examining every painting, sculpture, and tapestry. Richard followed, quieter than usual, observing both the child and the art with a careful attentiveness that Lauren had never seen before. He explained subtle details of brushwork, the history of artists, and the intent behind each piece in simple, elegant terms. Sophie's small hands clutched his as she marveled at colors and forms, her excitement infectious. Lauren, walking just behind, felt a rush of gratitude and disbelief. How could a man so formidable, so distant in the world, allow himself to be swept into the small, tender moments of life so completely? Evenings back at the penthouse became their sanctuary. Sophie would curl on the rug with her gloves beside her, reading or drawing, while Lauren prepared light dinners. Richard would appear from the study occasionally, observing, commenting softly, or merely sitting with them, his posture relaxed, his eyes tracing the child's movements with an intensity that was both protective and enthralled. The aura of fear and distance that once defined him had softened into a quiet, profound attentiveness. He was no longer the unreachable billionaire. He was a man capable of delight, of gentle humor, of quiet reverence for life's small, magical details. One night, as rain streaked against the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lauren found herself on the terrace with Richard, Sophie asleep inside, her soft breathing echoing through the apartment. They stood side by side, looking out over the city. The lights shimmered through the rain like molten gold, and Lauren felt an almost dizzying sense of serenity. "I never imagined life could feel like this," she admitted softly. "So full, so alive." Richard nodded, his gaze distant yet tender. "She teaches me things I forgot existed," he said. "Trust, wonder, patience." The words carried a weight, a quiet admission of change that stretched beyond the walls of the penthouse. Lauren realized that the small gestures, the cookies, the gloves, the laughter, had done more than bridge worlds. They had rewritten the very architecture of his life, opening spaces that had long been sealed. As weeks turned into months, the penthouse, once an emblem of isolation and control, became a home in every sense of the word. The air was lighter, laughter frequent, and small surprises. Art supplies, cookies, books, even quiet notes of appreciation appeared spontaneously. Richard's presence, once imposing and cold, softened into a steady warmth, his actions guided by genuine care rather than obligation. Lauren watched as Sophie grew radiant, gloves occasionally flapping as she raced through the apartment, and realized the extraordinary truth. The little things, the unexpected gifts, had created a transformation more profound than any luxury, more enduring than wealth, and infinitely richer than any contract or deal. In the quiet, luminous hours of the night, Lauren would sometimes catch Richard gazing at Sophie as she slept, a rare softness in his eyes, the faintest curve of a smile touching his lips. The man who had once been untouchable had been unmade and remade by the innocence and joy of a child. And as she observed him in these moments, Lauren understood, with a depth she had never known, that their story, sparked by a vanilla wafer and a pair of yellow gloves, was far from over. It was just beginning, and every day promised a new discovery, a new warmth, and a life rebuilt from the fragile, magical threads of laughter, trust, and love.